Hello, my name is Calvin Bahia and I am a Principal Economist at GSMAi Intelligence. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our showcase where my colleague Caroline Butler will present the findings of a recent study that explains how policymakers can carry out a socio-economic cost-benefit analysis for different authorization models in the 6 GHz frequency band, including both licensed and unlicensed options. It also presents the results of applying such an analysis in 12 countries. Next month, we will be publishing an update to the study where a further 12 countries will be added, including 7 markets in the APAC region. We hope you find the study both useful and interesting. Thank you very much.
So firstly, an introduction to the topic. I'm then going to go and give you an overview of the modelling methodology. And then, as Calvin said, a first view of the cost-benefit analysis results and some conclusions. The 6 GHz spectrum band represents the largest remaining block of mid-band spectrum that can be allocated to licensed or unlicensed use. So governments around the world need to make a carefully considered decision as to what the most efficient use of the band is to optimise the socio-economic benefits. To date, countries that have allocated spectrum in this band have taken divergent approaches. Some have assigned the full band to unlicensed use, while others are considering the full band for licensed usage. A third group are allocating the lower part of the band for unlicensed use and considering the upper part for licensed use. So this study carries out a cost-benefit analysis of different assignment options for the 6 GHz spectrum band. We look at expected traffic demand and supply for both 5G and Wi-Fi, whereby supply is partly determined by the amount of spectrum available. If there is a capacity constraint relative to mobile broadband and Wi-Fi traffic demand, this may be alleviated with 6 GHz spectrum and will generate socioeconomic benefits by reducing prices or increasing network quality, or a mix of both. We compare the socioeconomic benefits of 3 scenarios of different allocations of the band. We do this relative to a baseline scenario of unassigned 6 GHz spectrum. Scenario 1 here on this chart, represented by the all blue bar, is all of the 6 GHz band assigned to licensed use. Scenario 2, represented by the red bar, is all of the band assigned to unlicensed use. And then we have scenario 3, which is 500 megahertz of the band assigned to unlicensed use and 700 megahertz of the band to licensed use. The analysis covers the time period up to 2035 and 12 countries, with more to follow in phase 2. Looking at the market trends for mobile and fixed broadband, in countries with widespread fixed broadband infrastructure, mobile tends to provide on-the-go connectivity, and Wi-Fi use is common for a significant portion of indoor users. However, in many countries in this study, especially low and middle-income countries, the adoption of fixed broadband remains limited. And overall, we find that the optimal assignment policy for the 6 GHz spectrum band depends mainly on the current expected relative adoption of 5G and fixed fibre or cable broadband services in each market, along with the speeds that fixed broadband can offer consumers. So both 5G and Wi-Fi 6 are expected to drive continued increases in traffic. Increased demand will be driven by new users, along with consumers using more devices with more advanced capabilities, as well as using existing devices more. 5G is the latest technology for mobile and has started being deployed in many markets, offering significantly faster speeds than 4G and allowing for high reliability and very low latency. The rollout of Wi-Fi 6 also offers faster speeds and lower latencies than previous generations of Wi-Fi. As usage of both increases, mobile and Wi-Fi will remain complementary technologies. Both 5G and fixed broadband are digital technologies that are widely regarded as general purpose technologies. They drive economic gains because they enable tools and processes for quicker, cheaper, and more convenient production, which improves the productivity of firms and workers. They also lower information search and knowledge costs of consumers and producers, enabling new transactions and improving existing ones. Hence, studies have found a causal link between the adoption of mobile and fixed internet and GDP, and so we can model a socio-economic impact of adoption. I will give an overview of the traffic demand and capacity supply models. So to estimate the impact of assigning additional spectrum for 5G or Wi-Fi, we developed 2 supply and demand models for network capacity for the period between 2021 and 2035, based on current and expected market growth. Here is a flowchart of the 5G traffic demand and capacity supply model. 5G traffic demand is driven by expected 5G adoption, the minimum performance requirements, i.e. 100 megabits per second download speeds and 5 megabits per second upload speeds, Wi-Fi offload, and the share of connected users that are active. We also assume a growth in traffic demand over time to reflect the increased data used by 5G users. 5G capacity supply is driven by the amount of spectrum available, the number of sites deployed, and also spectral efficiencies. We then estimate the number of sites needed to meet traffic demand given the 5G spectral efficiencies for all available spectrum and based on the three scenarios that I gave you an overview of before. So just to recap them, it's either all of the band assigned to 5G, 700 megahertz of the band assigned to 5G, or none of the band. We compare with these scenarios to a scenario where all of the band is available for license use against the scenarios where less spectrum is available, and there are three outcomes. Operators do not densify their networks while the capacity increases, which means that traffic demand exceeds the capacity supply and consumers suffer a reduction in quality of service. Or operators densify the network to meet demand, meaning more sites that incur higher costs, or a combination of both. Now looking at the supply and demand model for Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi traffic demand is driven by fixed broadband adoption, in particular fibre to the home or building and cable adoption, which can provide higher speeds. It's also driven by the adoption of various devices in each household, for example, smartphones, smart home devices, AR, VR, gaming consoles, etc. The performance requirements for each of these devices, the proportion of fixed and cellular traffic that is loaded onto the Wi-Fi network, i.e. the Wi-Fi offload. And we also assume a growth in demand over time, again to reflect increased data use and device adoption by consumers. Wi-Fi capacity supply is driven by the amount of spectrum available and the spectral efficiencies. We compare the Wi-Fi traffic demand and supply capacity over the period of analysis for the three scenarios. Again, I gave an overview before, but I'll just remind everyone. So one of these is the 6 gigahertz available for unlicensed use for all of the band assigned to unlicensed use, or 500 megahertz of the band, or 0 megahertz. So out of all these variables, there are some key drivers of benefits from 6 gigahertz spectrum. Firstly, the existing spectrum availability for licensed and unlicensed use. So the existing and future spectrum allocation to licensed mobile use or unlicensed use in other bands other than 6 gigahertz will determine the supply constraints relative to the traffic demand, and therefore the requirement for any additional spectrum from the 6 gigahertz band. Then we look at the utilization of high band spectrum for licensed and unlicensed use. The benefits for unlicensed can also depend on the utilization of available high band spectrum. Utilization of spectrum in the 60 gigahertz band for up to 30% Wi-Fi traffic demand will reduce the amount of traffic demand that is reliant on other spectrum bands and reduce the benefits from allocating 6 gigahertz spectrum. Not using the 60 gigahertz band for unlicensed use would represent an inefficient use of spectrum, and usage of high bands is always assumed for mobile. And we also look at fixed broadband speeds as a key driver. The existing and future fixed broadband infrastructure in a market will determine the maximum speeds achievable over a Wi-Fi connection, and therefore the traffic demand. So these are a first look at the results. Less spectrum assigned to 5G means lower speeds or higher costs. So starting by looking at the chart on the left, with less spectrum, operators could densify networks to meet the 100 megabits per second download speeds requirement for 5G. This means mobile operators would face an average of around 65% higher annual costs to achieve the 100 megabits per second performance without any of the 6 gigahertz band, or 20% higher costs with 700 megahertz of the 6 gigahertz band compared to an assignment of the full band. Increased costs would have a negative impact on 5G adoption, and densification would also have a negative impact on the environment. Or looking at the chart on the right, assuming no change in network densification or 5G adoption, 5G download speeds would be reduced to around 50 megabits per second without any of the 6 gigahertz band assigned, or 80 megabits per second with 700 megahertz of the band, both of which are below the 5G performance requirement of 100 megabits per second for download speeds, which could be achieved with the full band. It's worth noting that operators may reach the technical limits of network densification, so this fall in speeds could be unavoidable. So then we consider the question, would assigning less spectrum to unlicensed use create a capacity constraint for Wi-Fi traffic? Starting with the spectrum supply for unlicensed use, the red lines on this chart represent the total spectrum supply for unlicensed use in each scenario included in the analysis. So scenario 1 capacity supply is represented by the dark red line at the bottom there. This is with none of the 6 GHz band assigned to unlicensed use. Then scenario 3 capacity supply is the red line in the middle with 500 MHz of the 6 GHz band assigned to unlicensed use. Scenario 2 capacity supply, the pink line at the top, is with all of the 6 GHz band assigned to unlicensed use. Then the green lines on this chart represent Wi-Fi traffic demand from 3 illustrative households. Household 1, the dark green line, is based on 11 connected devices being concurrently used, and this is the maximum number of devices in our study. Household 2, the line in the middle, is based on 6 connected devices being used, which is the average in our study. And household 3 is based on 3 connected devices being used, which is the minimum in our study. So we can see a range of traffic demand there based on these different assumptions around devices. Now we look at the impact of fibre to the home or cable speed limit assumptions on the existence of a capacity crunch. If fibre to the home or cable speeds reach a maximum of 1 gigabits per second over the period of analysis, which is represented by the dotted line right at the bottom of that chart, then household traffic demand will never surpass the spectrum capacity for Wi-Fi, even without any spectrum from the 6 GHz band. So that lowest dark red line for capacity. If maximum fibre to the home or cable speeds reach 10 gigabits over the period of analysis, a capacity crunch without any spectrum assigned to unlicensed use, i.e. scenario 1, depends on the level of household traffic demand. A capacity crunch would happen in around 2029 with the maximum number of devices, for example, or 2033 with the average, and we see no capacity crunch with the minimum number of devices. And there are no capacity crunches if maximum fibre to the home or cable speeds reach 10 gigabits per second and there is 500 megahertz of the 6 gigahertz band assigned to unlicensed use, i.e. the supply represented by the red line in the middle. So now we look at the results of the cost-benefit analysis, and I'm going to present 4 sets of results for each of the countries with different assumptions around the fibre to the home or cable speed limits and the use of the high band, the 60 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi. So the dot plot here, I'll just give a quick overview of that. It shows the economic impact of the scenarios as a cumulative benefit, so up to 2035, as a percentage of GDP in 2035. The green dots represent the results for scenario 1, i.e. all of the band to licensed use. The red dots represent scenario 2, all of the band to unlicensed use, and the purple is scenario 3, i.e. mixed use of the band. And in the bottom right-hand corner there's another overview of these scenarios. So scenario 1, i.e. all of the band to licensed use, will deliver the largest benefits across all countries. So we can see there on the dot plot that these green-blue dots at the top, if fixed broadband technologies do not provide maximum speeds above 5 gigabits per second, and if the 60 gigahertz band is available for unlicensed use for up to 30% of Wi-Fi traffic. Now looking at a different mix of assumptions, we see that scenario 1, i.e. all of the band to licensed use, will still generally deliver the largest benefits across all the countries if fixed broadband technologies do not provide maximum user speeds above 10 gigabits per second to all users, and if a portion of Wi-Fi traffic is offloaded to the 60 gigahertz band. In some cases, depending on country-specific key drivers that I went over before, scenario 3 will deliver the greatest benefit, 500 megahertz assigned to unlicensed and 700 megahertz assigned to licensed use, although generally it is seen that scenario 1 delivers the greatest benefits. Again, scenario 1 will generally deliver the largest benefits across all countries if fixed broadband technologies do not provide maximum user speeds above 5 gigabits per second. And here we assume that the 60 gigahertz band is not used by Wi-Fi. In some cases, again, depending on country-specific key drivers, scenario 3 will deliver the greatest benefit. Scenario 3 will generally deliver the largest benefits across all countries if fixed broadband technologies do not provide maximum available speeds above 10 gigabits per second, and if the 60 gigahertz band is not used by Wi-Fi where available for unlicensed. Again, in some cases, depending on the key country drivers, scenario 1 delivers the greatest benefit here. Scenario 2, so all of the 6 GHz band assigned to unlicensed use, was not found to be the most beneficial allocation with any combination of these different assumptions. So it was either scenario 1, the whole band to licensed use, or scenario 3, the mix of the band assigned that gave the greatest benefits. So overall, we find that the optimal assignment policy mainly depends on the expected adoption of 5G and fixed fibre or cable broadband services in each market, along with the speeds that fixed broadband can offer consumers. Scenario 1, all of the 6 GHz band assigned to licensed use will deliver the largest benefits across all countries if fixed broadband technologies do not provide maximum available speeds above 5 gigabits per second. Scenario 1 will still deliver the largest benefits across most countries if fixed broadband provides maximum use speeds up to 10 gigabits per second and if a portion of Wi-Fi traffic is offloaded to the 60 GHz band. Scenario 3, 700 megahertz assigned to licensed use and 500 megahertz assigned to unlicensed use will deliver the largest benefits if fibre to the home and cable broadband adoption is widespread. They support maximum use speeds of 10 gigabits per second to all users, and the 60 gigahertz band is not utilised by Wi-Fi. Again, scenario 2, so all of the 6 gigahertz band assigned to unlicensed use, was not found to be the most beneficial allocation in any of the considered analyses, i.e. with any combination of these different assumptions.